Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Aye.
Any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the ayes are 44 and the nays are 52. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, at this point I would ask unanimous consent that the following first-degree amendments be in order to be called up: Hagan 1031 and Durbin-Coburn 953, and that we have 5 minutes of debate on the Hagan amendment, that there be 10 minutes allotted to Senators Durbin and Coburn for their amendment, and that I would reserve 5 minutes that I would control on their amendment. That the time until 3:15, that we have a vote then at 3:15, and that when we vote in relation to the amendments, we proceed to the vote in the order listed, that no second-degree amendments be in order to either amendment prior to the votes. There will be 2 minutes equally divided between the votes. And then finally, upon disposition, Senator Merkley will be recognized.
Is there objection?
Madam President, we have no objection.
Without objection. Senator from North Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to call up amendment number 1031.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from North Carolina, Mrs. Hagan, proposes amendment number 1031.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to offer an amendment to make sure we are doing all we can to prevent fraud and abuse in the federal crop insurance program. The issue of fraud in this program hit home for me in March of this year when the Justice Department announced a $100 million crop insurance fraud case in eastern North Carolina, the largest ever of its kind. 41 defendants were found guilty, and many are serving prison time for profiting from false claims for losses of soybeans, wheat, tobacco, and corn. Following this incident, I've regularly had farmers come up to me and tell me they're nervous. They're nervous that the actions of a few bad actors will lead the federal government to cease providing crop insurance assistance. In these difficult budget times, these are valid concerns. For federal assistance to continue, the integrity of these programs must be rock solid. Crop insurance fraud not only harms the integrity of federal safety net programs and increases the cost to taxpayers, it also drives up the cost of the insurance programs for our honest, law-abiding farmers. The amendment that I'm offering would provide additional tools to the Risk Management Agency to analyze and combat fraud, waste, and abuse. The Risk Management Agency can expand the sampling requirements to test for and address the concerns with these improper program payments. This is in accordance with the Federal Improper Payments Information Act, the Elimination Recovery Act, as recommended by the Officer of the Inspector General. The Risk Management Agency can increase the number of reviews of the approved insurance providers conducted each year. Currently, we're able to review only about 1/3 of these providers due to our resource constraints. It also will provide additional support to data mining activities to detect the fraud and abuse in the program and develop proactive underwriting and loss adjustment applications to minimize the scope for such activities to occur. The Farm Bill before us now includes extensive reforms and creates a host of new safety net programs. As the complexity of these programs grow, the resources needed to oversee these programs are actually shrinking. This amendment will provide the resources necessary to proactively detect and combat fraud and abuse. Funding for this amendment will come out of the general savings contained in the underlying bill. The cost of this amendment is minimal, and I believe this investment will generate substantial savings for taxpayers, expanding our efforts to tackle the fraud and abuse in the crop insurance program. Protecting the integrity of these programs is critical to ensuring the safety net programs are available for the vast majority of our farmers who are honest, and to avoid undermining public confidence in these programs. Madam President, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, through no one's fault but my own, I got here a couple minutes late for the last amendment, the vote on the Feinstein amendment. I would have voted aye had I gotten here in time, and I ask unanimous consent that what I have just said be placed in the record immediately following the Feinstein amendment.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator.
Madam President, I support the amendment offered by the Senator from North Carolina, Ms. Hagan. This amendment would provide additional support for data mining activities to detect fraud. It would develop proactive underwriting and loss adjustment applications to minimize the scope for such activities to occur. It would help reduce improper payments through better controls and reviews of policies. All of these will result in saving taxpayer money and ensure program integrity in the long run. I urge approval of the amendment.
Yield's time. Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, how much time is remaining for the Durbin-Coburn or Coburn-Durbin amendment?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Would you please notify me when I've used 2 minutes?
Yes, I will, Senator.
Thank you very much. The Coburn-Durbin amendment says this: we have a crop insurance program in America. If you're a farmer, you buy crop insurance because you could have a drought, a flood, lose your crop, or the market price could fall down to nothing. So you buy insurance to cover the loss. But it isn't really insurance like we understand insurance, not like fire insurance or auto insurance, because you see the farmers don't pay enough in premiums to cover the actual losses paid out by crop insurance. In fact, the farmer's contribution to crop insurance is only 38% of the actual premium cost. Who pays the rest? Hold up your hand, America. All the taxpayers of this country subsidize crop insurance. 62%. What did it cost us last year? Over $7 billion. And then an additional $1 billion to administer the program. Here's what this amendment says. We stand behind crop insurance. We believe in crop insurance. But for that tiny 1% of farmers across America making over $750,000 a year, their federal subsidy will be cut from 62% on average to 47%. Let me tell you, they can afford it. And we will save over the span of 10 years $1 billion. $1 billion that we can better spend either to reduce our debt or on critical programs for this country. I want farmers to have crop insurance, but I want those who are doing so well in this system, they get hundreds of thousands of dollars of federal subsidy to show a little bit of sacrifice on their part. Keep this program sound, keep it fair. The Durbin-Coburn amendment moves in that direction. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment. And I yield to my friend from Oklahoma.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
44% of the farmers in this country receive 33% of the benefits from crop insurance. I don't think it could be said any better than Senator Durbin has said it. The point being is what we ought to do is make sure there's a safety net. The crop insurance is the way to do that. But we ought to, like we're on every other program, we're going to eventually ask those that have more to participate more. And what this is about is actually asking those who, the top 5, matter of fact, the top 5 farmers in the country actually have their location and how much they get. The number 1 farmer in the country gets $1.9 million worth of subsidies a year. All we're going to do is cut his subsidy to $1.6 million. Now, his income's far in excess of $750,000. The number 2 farmer in the year is from Washington State. We're going to cut his subsidy from $1.7 million to $1.4 million. Of course, he made far more than that in the last year and the previous years. The number 3, Minnesota, we're just going to cut from 1.6 to 1.4. Still, we're going to subsidize $1.4 million a year for this one individual who's going to make in excess of $2 million this year. So all we're asking is to appropriately limit the benefits that are coming from borrowed money against our children's future for the very wealthy in this country. And I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Well, I very much appreciate Senator Durbin and Senator Coburn's amendment. I would urge my colleagues to oppose this, first of all, by saying that crop insurance is insurance, and the farmer gets a bill, not a check. They get a bill. And the question is whether or not we're going to provide a discount so that it's an affordable policy. We've ended subsidies through direct payments. We want them to move to a voluntary system of crop insurance. They get a bill. It's got to be a bill that they can afford to be able to provide the coverage. And then there is no payout unless you have a loss, unless there's a flood or some other kind of loss, droughts, whatever has happened. It's insurance. There are several reasons why this is not the same vote that the Senate took last year on this amendment. With the historic agreement to attach conservation compliance to crop insurance, potentially reducing the acres of numbers of producers covered by crop insurance will only reduce the environmental benefits and could lead to draining wetlands or plowing up highly erodible land. So let me say this another way. Of course, crop insurance support goes to the most goes to the largest farmers because they have the most land to insure. I mean, that's just by definition. Like in any larger the insurance policy, the more you're trying to cover. The question is, and the reason conservationists and environmentalists have come together, because they want those large tracts to be conservation compliant. There's even more environmental impact on the large tracts than there are on the small tracts, which is why we saw this historic agreement between 30-some different farm groups and environmental and conservation groups to say, we'll support crop insurance, but you have to do conservation compliance on all of the land. Limiting crop insurance support to producers will cause producers with large pieces of land to leave the insurance system, losing the conservation benefits and possibly increasing the cost, again, to smaller providers. If everybody's not in, then the costs go up for who is in. And in fact, we know that if we take the largest purchasers out, it's estimated that we could see premiums nearly go up 40% for those that are currently in the system, and we are more likely to go back to ad hoc disaster assistance. In the drought of 2012, one of the worst on record for U.S. farmers, there were no calls for our crops to receive ad hoc disaster assistance. The corn and wheat and soybean growers and others across the country were able to survive. Why? Because of crop insurance, and it worked. So I would just urge colleagues to take a second look at this. We're talking about preserving a historic agreement that came together around conservation compliance, and we want to make sure all of the land that is in crop insurance is covered and we're protecting our soil and our water. So I would ask for a no vote on the amendment.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
You know, the number one person that cares about the environmental quality of their land is the farmer. And the bigger the farmer, the more they care. The number 4 farmer, as far as crop insurance in the country, farms 105,000 acres. Average farmer in Oklahoma is 160 acres. We're not talking about small, but they'll make an economic decision, and if a 15% bump in their premium will cause them to go out, they'll go out. But they won't go out because it's too much of a sweetheart deal. We're still going to pay almost half of their crop insurance bill, 50%. You can't. Anybody else have that kind of deal going? Nobody has that kind of deal going. So what we're saying is, let's save some money. Let's ask those that actually are more well-endowed with benefits and profits to pay a fairer share of what they should be based on the benefit they get. The one thing that the chairwoman didn't say is these are the guys that collect the big bucks when there is one. So they do pay a portion of it, but their payouts are 10 times higher than the average farmer, hundreds of times higher than the average farmer. So they'll make an economic decision, and they're not going to walk away from this because it's still, even at 48%, it's too sweet of a deal for any of them to ever walk away. There's no study that says they'll walk away. And wait and see, Senator Durbin and I will come down and offer mea culpas in 2 years if they've walked away on the Senate floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Michigan.
I appreciate the confidence that my friend from Oklahoma has about what business decisions will be made. Let's assume they don't walk away from crop insurance. They will be walking away from conservation compliance if they are not required to do that. If this agreement falls apart, and it is an agreement that was delicately put together between over 30 different farm organizations and conservation and environmental folks to work together to support crop insurance but to require environmental compliance. They may or may not make decisions about crop insurance. I do know that if they do leave, that the folks in the program, which are small and medium-sized programs, just the matter of economics, it's like any other kind of insurance, they'll see their costs go up. We do know that. But we also have this broader question that relates to the large farmers that you're talking about, where the benefit to having comprehensive conservation compliance for our country is a benefit that we want to make sure that we keep intact. And it is undermined with the passage of this amendment.
Let me check, Senator. Senators Durbin and Coburn have 5 minutes remaining. Senator Hagan has 1 minute remaining. And Senator Stabenow has 1 minute remaining.
I'd just make the point, the large farmers I know in Oklahoma, they really don't want the government telling them what kind of agreement they're going to have with their crop insurance and environmental things. We have a ton of rules already. What I do know is there's nobody in Oklahoma that cares more about the environment than our farmers. And so I would disagree that there's a disconnect if you limit the crop insurance subsidy to the very large farmers in Oklahoma, that they're not going to do what's in the best interest of the environment because it's the benefit of their own economic well-being. Look, we understand a deal was cut to get to where you are on the bill. We're not trying to disturb that. We don't want to disturb that. But our purpose is we can't continue down where we're subsidizing the very well-heeled in this country to the same level that we try to protect those that are marginal. And we just can't do it. And we could have made this a whole lot different. We could have lowered it even lower. We didn't do that. The average median family income in this country is less than $60,000. So we're talking about almost 15 times more than the average family in this country makes. And saying if you make more than that, maybe you could take a little trim off the subsidy of your crop insurance. That's not an unfair question. I'd yield to my colleague from Illinois.
Thank the senator from Oklahoma. Let's get it straight. Every farmer buying crop insurance gets a subsidy. The question is, how big is the subsidy? Is it 62% of the actual premium cost? That's what they're all receiving now. Or is it going to end up being 47 or 48%, which is what we're suggesting for 1% of the farmers, the wealthiest farmers? How many are we talking about? There are roughly 2 million farmers in America. The people we're talking about, 20,000. 20,000 farmers would be affected by our amendment. You would think that we're about to destroy agriculture in America. There are 2 million farmers. All of them get a subsidy. What Senator Coburn and I say, let's nick the subsidy for the wealthiest. And what we hear is that's just too much to ask. It's too much sacrifice. I don't think so. In one example in Illinois, I won't read the example from other Midwestern states. One example in Illinois, a corn and soybean grower received $740,000 in premium subsidies to cover the crops he planted in my state in 18 counties. There are 102 counties in Illinois. This is a big deal. This farmer, we would cut his subsidy from $740,000 to $639,000. Do you think he'll notice? Do you think he'll stop buying crop insurance on what he's planted in 18 counties? I don't think so. At a time when we're asking sacrifice from people in Head Start programs across America, can we be asking a little bit of sacrifice from 20,000 of the wealthiest farmers out of 2 million? I don't think it's too much to ask. Madam President, I ask that the amendment be called for consideration.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Illinois, Mr. Durbin, for himself and Mr. Coburn, proposes an amendment number 953.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, if I might just, it was my understanding that the consent was for the Hagan Amendment and then the Durbin-Coburn Amendment. So if we could proceed in that order.
That is the order on which they will be voted.
Thank you.
I'd ask for yeas and nays on our amendment and yield back our time.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Yeas and nays on the Hagan Amendment. I would ask for yeas and nays on the Hagan Amendment.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. Yeas and nays are so ordered.
And we would yield back all time.
If all time is yielded back, the question is on Amendment 1031. The yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blumenthal, Cardin, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Cowan, Durbin, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Heitkamp, Isaacson, Johans, Kane, Klobuchar, Manchin, McCaskill, McConnell, Moran, Murray, Rockefeller, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Toomey, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Wicker. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Cornyn, Aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye.
So I just read the other.
Anyone wishing to vote or change their vote?
Anyone wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 94, the nays 0. The amendment is agreed to. Order. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 953 offered by the senator from Illinois, Mr. Durbin. Who yields time?
Madam President?
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I'm co-sponsoring this amendment that says the wealthiest 20,000 farmers in America will pay slightly more for their crop insurance so that the program will be a sound program for all farmers. I urge my colleagues, in the name of deficit reduction and making this a good program, vote yes on the Durbin-Coburn amendment.
Madam President,
Senator from Michigan.
I would urge a no vote for a number of reasons, but let me simply say the problem with increasing crop insurance premiums by about 40%, which is what this does, is we're going to reduce participation in crop insurance, reduce coverage, and drive up premiums. And most importantly, for me, we have a historic agreement to tie crop insurance to conservation compliance, and this would undermine that effort. I would urge a no vote, and before proceeding, Madam President, I want to thank everyone for their good work up to this point, announce there will be no further votes. The next vote will be 5:30 on the Monday that we return, and we will proceed and complete the bill. Thank you.
The question is on Amendment 953. The yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McKean, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow,
Yes.
Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Baldwin, Begich, Blumenthal, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cruz, Durbin, Feinstein, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heinrich, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Kirk, Lee, Levin, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Rubio, Scott, Shaheen, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Baucus, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Cochran, Cowan, Crapo, Donnelly, Enzi, Fisher, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heitkamp, Hirono, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Kane, Landrieu, Leahy, McConnell, Moran, Pryor, Risch, Roberts, Sanders, Shelby, Stabenow, Wicker. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no.